The nonspecific defenses are those that will act first. So they're the first to respond to any type of threat, whether it be a virus, a bacteria, or something just like pollen. Whereas the acquired specific defenses are going to come to the aid of the individual after a certain amount of time, but they might not act as quickly, but they do stick around for a longer amount of time. So they're useful through the course of many years. And so you might initially think that the innate defenses are more important, but in reality, it's a combination of these two categories which are necessary to defend the host. Because if we only had the innate and not the acquired defenses, then we would be getting sick from every time that we were exposed to the cold virus, for example. So we've all had multiple colds in our lives, but they've all been a different strain of cold. And for example, if you get the flu one year, you're not going to get it again. Why is that? That is because of your acquired defenses. Of course, our innate defenses are very important with dealing with that initial experience of the flu. But it is pretty important that we don't keep on getting that same flu, because if you did, then that would really wear us down, because we just give the flu to, our partner or our children or our classmates, and then we would get it back from them. But that's not actually what happens. And when we go down below this level of the green, we see there's a row of blue boxes that have the lines of defense, the first, second, and third. And so we see that the first and second lines of defense fall under the non-specific defenses, and then the third line of defense, of course, falls under the acquired or specific defenses. And we can see that then below that there are the specific organs and parts of the body and cells of the individual that are involved in these different lines of defenses. And I think the book particularly points out that there is some overlap here between the second line of defense and the third line of defense, between the gamma delta T cells and the natural killer T cells. And that'll be important when we start talking about the next chapter. And I don't want you to be able to cite all of the, for example, physical barriers that are part of the first line of defense, but I do want you to be able to recognize the important physical barriers such as the skin, earwax, nasal hair, things like that. And similarly, you don't have to know, every single step of inflammation and every single step of fever, for example, but I do want you to know that phagocytosis, inflammation, fever, and antimicrobial products are part of that second line of defense. And then, of course, the third line of defense, B cells and T cells are very important, and we'll talk a little bit more in a couple of minutes about what specifically we need to get out of those or on those topics. So I'm going to skip through some of these slides because they're pretty basic. I do want to point this out because this is related to some things that we have talked about in the past. And I'm just going to blow up this picture right now. So this image shows specifically a white blood cell coming into contact with these normal self cells. So in other words, this orange cell with the blue proteins, that is just some cell. Maybe it's a red blood cell, maybe it's a skin cell, or just any kind of cell that you would normally have in your body. And the white blood cell, the purple one, is able to bind to these proteins on the surface of the orange cell and say, okay, this is part of the self. We don't need to have an immune response to this. And now we talked about things similar to this, right? We've talked about how viruses get into host cells by using some of these same proteins. So that's pretty tricky. And we start to see just how crazy it is that viruses make use of these proteins. For example, if this blue protein on the outside of the orange cell, a virus might take advantage of that and bind to it. A specific virus that evolved to be able to bind to this protein. And we need that blue protein in order to signal to our white blood cells that, hey, this cell is okay, is itself cell. And also keep in mind, these cells are simplified. So a self cell is not going to just have one type of protein on the outside. It's going to have many types of protein. Some of them are going to be signaling, hey, I'm a self cell, don't attack me. And some of them are going to be doing other things. Some of them might be enzymatic proteins. Some of them might bind to different nutrients in the environment, or some of them might help to bring in things like sodium into the cell. So keep that in mind, and that'll become more clear a little bit later once we talk more about the acquired immunity. Okay, so moving down here, once we see that the white blood cell, that purple cell, is coming into contact with a bacterium. So that bacterium does have proteins on its surface, but they're not the proteins that signal that it's part of ourselves. Obviously, because it's not part of ourselves, it is a bacterium. And so the white blood cell will bind to these sugar or proteins on the outside of the bacterial cell, and it does not recognize it as self, so it begins to engulf it. And once it engulfs it, then the white blood cell is going to actually destroy that bacterial cell. And we see that, again, is very similar to the circumstances we were talking about with viruses being engulfed. So, of course, in the case of a virus, that virus might want to be engulfed and might need to be engulfed in order to infect that cell. But that's not true of these bacteria, of any bacteria, more or less. So when a bacteria becomes engulfed, it does end up in its own little compartment, as we see at the bottom here. But it's really bad for the bacterium because then it's just going to get digested. But that is how these white blood cells work. So this is how any cell that is part of the immune system that is destroying foreign matter through phagocytosis or endocytosis works. It's going to bring it in, put it in its own compartment, and then it's going to destroy it. And some special cells will then have another step, but we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. Okay, so as you've noticed, we're talking mainly about white blood cells in these two chapters. The red blood cells are not of interest to us right now when we're talking about the immune system. So the white blood cells are moving throughout the body, as you know. They're patrolling, they're binding the proteins on the outsides of all types of cells. And I just wanted to go through this slide to mention at the end here that many autoimmune disorders are a result of the immune system mistakenly attacking the body's own tissues and cells. So that means that even if the cell that the white blood cell is binding to is displaying these self proteins, so even if the white blood cell binds to a cell and it has these blue proteins, then for some reason the white blood cell still reacts as if this is a danger and it's a non-self cell. So that is an example of things that often happen in an autoimmune disease and some certain other conditions when your immune system is actually working against you. And these words, antigens and markers, are very important because these are the proteins that are actually on the surface of the cell. So we've been just referring to them as proteins on the cell surface, but they are called antigens. They're also sometimes referred to as markers, but that is pretty general, so we want to stick with antigens if we can. So again, those consist of proteins and or sugars, and so we've talked a little bit about things in this category before. So we have things like glycoproteins and glycolipids, which are associated with the cell membrane. And I'm trying to pull up a picture of a glycolipid now. And this is a perfect picture. It's just something that is going to be associated with that membrane. And it's going to stick out of the cell membrane. And so we could see here that this glycolipid is just a chain of carbohydrates, which is referred to as a sugar residue, and it is connected to the lipid. which is part of the phospholipid bilayer. And because it is sticking out towards the outside of the cell, it can be bound by these white blood cells. And this glycolipid, if it's on one of our cells, will indicate, hey, I'm a self cell. It might be even more specific than that. It might say, I'm a healthy self cell, or I'm a cell from a skin tissue or from a lymphoid organ. It all depends on that specific cell. And so again, those are antigens or markers. I just showed an example of a sugar marker, but we can also have protein markers that would be very similar. So now we have these, we're starting in on the acronyms. So one of the acronyms here is the PAMPs, Pathogen-Associated Molecular Patterns. And this stands for, it's a type of marker or antigen that many types of microbes have in common. So that would be, think about the things that we've talked about being targets for antibiotics. And those would be examples of PAMPs. So the textbook gave examples of like the lipopolysaccharide A, the different components of the cell wall. So those would be PAMPs because they are associated with bacteria and not with eukaryotes or the host. Then the molecule that matches up with a PAMP is a pattern recognition receptors, a PRR. And so the PRR is just the puzzle piece that binds to the PAMP. Because we are saying that a PAMP is a marker for a certain type of cell, and that type of cell is a bacterium, but you can't have a marker unless something is using that marker to recognize it. So our cells, our immune cells, have these PRRs, and the PRRs bind to PAMPs in order to recognize whatever cell that is as a bacterial cell. Okay, so the immune system, as you know if you read the chapter, is a network. It's a large, extensive conglomeration of different types of cells and tissues. And if you just focused even on the development of things like white blood cells, you would notice that, yes, there are many different organs that are involved in the immune system. So I'm just enlarging this. So right here we see in the middle the lymphatic system, and we see all of these lymph vessels and the lymph nodes in certain areas, and these are how our immune cells travel throughout the body. So I'm going to pause for 1 second here because the cat is going to intrude on the rest of the lecture if I don't take care of him.